Settle in, get comfortable, pull the covers up, close your eyes, and let everything else drift away. You're in the right place. The stadium lights have dimmed, the crowds have gone home, but the stories never stop. And tonight, here is a great one. Picture a modest football stadium in the middle of England, on a quiet weekday afternoon, long before any of what you're about to hear had happened. The stands are half empty. The club that plays here has spent most of its long history bouncing between divisions, admired by nobody outside its own city, expected by nobody to ever trouble the biggest and richest clubs in the country. This is Leicester City, a football club with more than a century of history and almost nothing in all that time to genuinely celebrate. This is a story about the single most improbable achievement in the modern history of English football. A story so unlikely that bookmakers, the people whose entire profession depends on correctly calculating what is possible, priced it at 5,000 to 1 against ever happening. Higher odds at the time than several things that sound like jokes. Higher odds than finding the Loch Ness Monster. Higher odds than Elvis Presley being found alive. The season before this story begins, Leicester City were bottom of the entire league at Christmas, given almost no chance of even staying in the competition they were about to conquer. And then, 12 months later, something happened that nobody inside football, and nobody outside it either, could properly explain even as they watched it unfold in front of them. Let the evening settle around you. Let your body grow heavy. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do except listen. Here is where it begins. Leicester City Football Club was founded in 1884 in a city in the East Midlands of England better known, for most of its history, for its shoe manufacturing and its textile industry than for anything achieved on a football pitch. The club has spent the overwhelming majority of the century and more since its founding shuttling between the second tier of English football and the very top flight, never quite establishing itself as a genuine force, never quite disappearing either, a permanently unremarkable presence in the story of the English game. There have been brief, modest moments of promise across those long decades. A handful of domestic cup finals reached and mostly lost. A handful of seasons finishing respectably in the middle of the top division, but nothing resembling the kind of sustained success that the biggest clubs in the country, the ones with the enormous stadiums and the global fan bases and the decades of accumulated silverware, would recognise as anything worth comparing to their own history. By the early 2010s, Leicester City exist, in the wider consciousness of English football, largely as a punchline, or at best a footnote. A club whose most famous recent moment of national attention had come not from anything achieved on the pitch, but from a mascot dressed as a chicken being escorted from the stadium after a bizarre and unrelated promotional stunt involving a fried chicken restaurant chain went wrong in full view of the cameras. This is, in the mid-2010s, roughly the level of profile that Leicester City occupy in English football. A club that people remember for the wrong reasons when they remember it at all. The club returns to the Premier League, the top division of English football, in 2014, having spent the previous decade toiling in the lower reaches of the second tier, and the general expectation among pundits and rival supporters alike is straightforward and largely unkind. Leicester City will spend one uncomfortable season back among the elite before being relegated straight back down to the division they have only just escaped from, a familiar and unremarkable story that plays out for newly promoted clubs across English football almost every single year. For much of that first season back in the top flight, the 2014 to 2015 campaign, this exact prediction appears to be playing out with grim, predictable accuracy. Leicester struggle from the very first weeks of the season, unable to translate the promise that had earned them promotion into anything resembling competitiveness against clubs with considerably greater resources, considerably greater squad depth, and considerably greater experience of surviving at this level. By Christmas of 2014, Leicester City sit bottom of the entire Premier League table. Not simply struggling, not simply in danger, bottom, the single worst position a club in the division can occupy, with more than half the season still remaining and a gap to safety that, by the calculations of most football statisticians at the time, made relegation not merely likely, but something close to a mathematical certainty. It is worth pausing here to properly register just how bleak this situation actually was, because the scale of what happens next only makes sense against the backdrop of exactly how hopeless things appeared in the winter of 2014. Teams that occupy the bottom of the Premier League table at Christmas are relegated in the overwhelming majority of cases, a pattern so consistent across the history of the competition that football statisticians treat it as close to an iron law of the sport. Leicester City, by any reasonable historical precedent, were finished. Newspaper reports from that specific December, revisited now with the benefit of everything that eventually followed, read almost like dispatches from an entirely different football club altogether, pundits and rival supporters alike, discussing Leicester's relegation not as a possibility to be debated, but as a foregone conclusion requiring no further serious analysis. The manager overseeing this apparently doomed campaign is Nigel Pearson, an experienced, no-nonsense English football man known for a certain bluntness in his dealings with the press, that occasionally generates its own headlines, separate from anything happening on the pitch. Pearson is not, by the standards of modern Premier League management, a fashionable or glamorous appointment, but he possesses a genuine tactical understanding of the game, and, crucially, a stubborn refusal to accept that his side's position at the bottom of the table in December represents the final word on their season. What happens across the remaining months of that 2014 to 2015 season becomes known, within English football, as the Great Escape, a phrase borrowed from wartime history and applied, with only slight exaggeration, to one of the most remarkable survival stories the Premier League had produced up to that point. Leicester City, from a position that had appeared to almost every neutral observer as beyond rescue, begin to win matches, not occasionally, not sporadically, repeatedly, across the crucial closing weeks of the season, against opponents who were, on paper, considerably better equipped to secure the points than a team sitting rock bottom of the entire division. The turnaround is built on a spine of players who will, within only a matter of months, become household names across the whole of English football, though almost nobody watching at the time has any real sense of what is coming. A tireless, combative Jamaican-born centre-back named Wes Morgan anchors a defence that gradually tightens and stops leaking the soft goals that had characterised the team's miserable autumn. A young, previously unheralded striker named Jamie Vardy, signed from non-league football only a couple of years earlier at a fee that most Premier League clubs would barely notice, begins finding the net with increasing regularity, his raw pace and directness causing problems for defenders who have simply never encountered anything quite like him before. Leicester win match after match through the spring of 2015, a run of results so unlikely and so completely against the expected pattern of a bottom-placed team's fate that football writers across the country begin, cautiously at first and then with growing conviction, to describe what is happening as one of the most remarkable escapes from relegation the Premier League has ever witnessed. By the final weeks of the season, Leicester have climbed clear of the relegation places entirely, securing their Premier League survival with matches still remaining, a turnaround so dramatic that it briefly becomes one of the most talked about stories in the entire English game. It would have been entirely reasonable, at this point, for the story of Leicester City to end there, a remarkable escape from relegation filed away, as one of those pleasant, surprising footnotes that English football occasionally produces before everything returns to the familiar, expected order of things. Nobody, not the players, not the manager, not the most optimistic Leicester supporter in the entire stadium, has any genuine sense that this improbable escape from the bottom of the table is merely the opening act of something considerably larger. And yet, in the strange, unpredictable logic that this particular story will keep demonstrating again and again, the very qualities that had powered the Great Escape, the resilience, the tactical discipline, the specific defensive solidity built around Wes Morgan, and the emerging goal threat of a striker nobody outside the East Midlands had previously heard of, would prove to be the exact foundations upon which something genuinely unprecedented was about to be built. Despite the escape, despite the against-the-odds survival, Nigel Pearson's time as Leicester manager comes to an end in the summer of 2015, departing the club amid a series of off-field controversies involving his son that had generated considerable negative press attention during the closing months of the previous campaign. It is, on the surface, an unremarkable managerial change of the kind that happens at football clubs across the country every single close season, barely registering as significant news beyond Leicester's own supporters. The man appointed to replace him, announced by the club in the summer of 2015, is greeted by the wider football media, not with curiosity or anticipation, but with something closer to open mockery. A reaction that will come to look, within less than 12 months, like one of the most spectacularly mistaken judgments in the recent history of English football punditry. His name is Claudio Ranieri, an Italian manager well into his 60s by this point in his career. With a long and generally respected history at a number of major European clubs including Chelsea, Valencia and Juventus, but with a reputation, fairly or not, for a certain tactical overcaution and a nickname, earned during his time at Chelsea some years earlier, that follows him throughout the remainder of his career. The Tinkerman, a title given to him by the English press for his tendency to make frequent and sometimes bewildering changes to his team selection and tactics, a nickname that carries within it a distinct undertone of mockery rather than admiration. Ranieri's most recent managerial position, immediately prior to his arrival at Leicester, had ended in a manner that does nothing to help his reputation among the sceptical English press. He had been appointed manager of the Greek national team only a matter of months earlier and had overseen a run of results so poor, including a defeat to the Faroe Islands, one of the weakest national teams in European football, that he had been dismissed from the position after only a handful of matches. It is against this specific and recent backdrop of professional embarrassment that Leicester City announced Claudio Ranieri as their new manager in the summer of 2015. The reaction from the English football media is swift and largely unkind. Prominent former players and pundits, appearing on television and writing in newspaper columns, describe the appointment using words like farcical and worrying, questioning aloud whether Leicester's ownership genuinely understood the scale of the job they had just entrusted to a man who had, only months earlier, been unable to guide a national team past one of the very weakest sides in international football. One particularly memorable piece of television punditry, delivered by a well-known former England international, dismisses the appointment outright, suggesting the club has made a serious mistake that will likely cost them their hard-won place in the Premier League. Ranieri himself, by every account from those who worked closely with him during this period, absorbs this widespread scepticism with a calm, almost bemused good humour that will come to define much of his public persona across the remarkable season that follows. He is, by nature and by decades of experience in a notoriously unforgiving profession, not a man easily rattled by criticism, and he sets about his new job at Leicester with a quiet, methodical thoroughness that goes almost entirely unnoticed by a football media, still convinced that his appointment represents a serious and possibly fatal mistake. Ranieri's own personal history offers some insight into the specific resilience he brought to this latest, widely mocked appointment. Born in Rome in the mid-1950s, the son of a butcher, Ranieri had enjoyed only a modest playing career before moving into coaching, building his managerial reputation gradually across several decades of Italian and Spanish football, before eventually arriving in the Premier League with Chelsea in the early 2000s. His career, across that long managerial journey, had included genuine successes alongside considerable disappointments, and by the time of his arrival at Leicester, in his mid-60s, Ranieri carries himself with the particular, hard-earned equanimity of a man who has experienced football's capacity for both triumph and humiliation many times over, and who has learned, across those decades, not to attach his own sense of self-worth too rigidly to the fickle judgments of football media or football supporters in any given moment. This specific quality of lived experience, the ability to absorb the widespread mockery that greeted his Leicester appointment without it visibly affecting his own confidence or his own approach to the job, proves to be one of his most significant assets across the remarkable season that follows. Younger, less experienced managers, subjected to the same level of public scepticism and ridicule that greeted Ranieri's appointment, might reasonably have felt considerable pressure to prove their doubters wrong through some dramatic, attention-seeking change of approach. Ranieri instead simply gets on with the actual work of coaching his new squad, unbothered by the noise surrounding him, trusting his own decades of accumulated football knowledge over the immediate judgment of pundits, who in most cases know considerably less about the day-to-day realities of coaching a football squad than he does. What none of the sceptical pundits, and indeed almost nobody inside professional football, could have possibly anticipated in the summer of 2015 is that Claudio Ranieri was about to preside over one of the most extraordinary single seasons any manager at any club in the entire history of English football has ever produced. But that story cannot properly begin without first understanding the specific players Ranieri inherited, and in particular the story of one specific player whose own personal journey to this point in his career is, in its own right, almost as improbable as the achievement the entire team was about to accomplish together. That player's name is Jamie Vardy, and to understand what happens next, it helps enormously to understand exactly where he came from, and exactly how far he had already travelled simply to be standing on a Premier League pitch at all. Jamie Vardy grows up in Sheffield, in the north of England, and joins the youth academy at Sheffield Wednesday, one of the city's 2 professional football clubs, as a boy with genuine promise. But by the age of 16, in a decision that will come to look, in hindsight, like one of the most significant misjudgments in the recent history of English football scouting, Sheffield Wednesday release him, judging him too small and lacking the physical attributes considered necessary for a professional career at the highest level. What follows for the teenage Jamie Vardy is not the story of a promising young player quietly working his way back up through another professional academy. It is instead several years spent almost entirely outside the professional game altogether, playing non-league football for a succession of small, unglamorous clubs that exist far below the radar of almost anyone who follows the sport professionally. He plays for Stocksbridge Park Steels, a semi-professional club in the Sheffield area, and continues, throughout this period, to work an ordinary day job alongside his football, employed at a factory that manufactures medical splints, cycling to training after long shifts on the factory floor, because this is simply what non-league football, for a player without the wages of a professional contract, actually requires of you. This period of Vardy's life, several years spent playing at a level so far removed from professional football that most Premier League clubs would never think to send a scout anywhere near it, becomes one of the central and most frequently retold elements of his entire story, precisely because it is so completely at odds with the conventional pathway that almost every other Premier League player has followed. While his eventual Leicester teammates were progressing through professional academies, playing organised youth football against similarly talented opposition, receiving the kind of specialist coaching that professional clubs provide as a matter of course, Jamie Vardy was working factory shifts and playing part-time football in front of crowds numbering in the hundreds rather than the tens of thousands. There are stories from this period, repeated many times in the years since as his fame grew, that capture something of the specific and unusual texture of his path into professional football. Accounts of him wearing an electronic monitoring tag on his ankle during part of this period, the result of an earlier altercation that he had to conceal beneath his socks while playing matches, a detail that speaks to a version of a footballer's youth almost unimaginably distant from the carefully managed academy pathways that most of his future Premier League colleagues had experienced. He moves on to Halifax Town, another semi-professional club, before eventually earning a move to Fleetwood Town, a club playing in the Conference, the 5th tier of English football, considerably below the professional divisions that most people watching Premier League football on a Saturday afternoon would even recognise as existing. It is at Fleetwood, in the 2012 to 2013 season, that Vardy finally begins to produce the kind of consistent goal-scoring form that starts to attract genuine professional attention, helping Fleetwood win promotion into the actual professional football league for the first time in the club's history. Leicester City, then playing in the 2nd tier of English football, and still 2 years away from their own return to the Premier League, signed Vardy from Fleetwood in the summer of 2012 for a fee reported at around £1 million, a transfer that becomes at the time a genuine record fee for a player moving from non-league football into the professional game. A modest headline in its own right, but nothing that suggested, to anyone watching at the time, that Leicester had just signed a player who would go on to break Premier League scoring records within only a few years. His early period at Leicester is one of gradual adjustment, rather than immediate stardom, a player still learning to translate the raw pace and directness that had made him so effective in non-league football into the considerably more sophisticated tactical environment of professional football at increasingly higher levels. But the specific qualities that will eventually make him so devastatingly effective, an extraordinary turn of pace over the first several yards, a relentless high-intensity pressing style that exhausts defenders across 90 minutes, and a predatory instinct for exploiting the exact moment a defensive line steps forward, gradually reveal themselves across his early seasons at the club, earning him steadily increasing respect from teammates and coaching staff who recognise, even in these early, still developing performances, the outline of something considerably more significant beginning to take shape. By the time Leicester secure their return to the Premier League and survive their first difficult season back among the elite through the Great Escape, Jamie Vardy has established himself as first-choice striker, and the goals that had helped power that unlikely survival campaign, scored against opponents with vastly greater resources and vastly more conventional footballing pedigrees, hint at something considerably more significant building beneath the surface of what still looks, to most outside observers, like an unremarkable Premier League squad simply relieved to have avoided relegation. Nobody, including Vardy himself by his own later admission, has any real sense heading into the 2015-16 season that the following 9 months are about to transform him from a factory worker turned non-league journeyman into one of the most talked about footballers on the entire planet, a name that will be discussed on television programmes and in newspapers across dozens of countries who had never previously had any reason to know anything about English football's second most successful club from the East Midlands. Alongside Jamie Vardy, and alongside the returning spine of players who had powered the Great Escape the previous spring, Claudio Ranieri's Leicester City squad, heading into the 2015-16 season, contains several other players whose stories in their own different ways are every bit as improbable as their captain's journey from a Sheffield factory floor to the Premier League. The most significant of these arrivals is a French midfielder named N'Golo Kanté, signed from Caen in the French second division only that summer, for a fee that most Premier League clubs would consider almost embarrassingly modest, for a player who would go on, within a remarkably short space of time, to be recognised as one of the finest midfielders anywhere in world football. Kanté arrives in England as a virtual unknown outside a small circle of French football observers, a slight, unassuming figure who does not, on first impression, look anything like the specific kind of dominant, all-action midfielder that his performances would soon reveal him to be. What Kanté possesses, and what becomes apparent to increasingly astonished opponents across the course of that remarkable season, is a covering ability and a work rate that appears to defy the ordinary physical limitations of the sport. He seems capable of covering every blade of grass across a football pitch, breaking up opposition attacks with an instinct for interception that borders on the uncanny, then instantly transitioning into supporting his own team's attacking play, only to be back in a defensive position moments later, as though he had never left it. Opposition managers and players, across the course of the season, begin to speak about him with a specific bewildered admiration, several suggesting, only half joking, that Leicester appear to be playing with two of him on the pitch at once. Alongside Kanté in midfield, an Algerian-born winger named Riyad Mahrez, signed a couple of years earlier from French second division football for another remarkably modest fee, begins to blossom into one of the most exciting attacking players in the entire Premier League. Mahrez possesses a close control and a dribbling ability that allows him to glide past defenders in a manner that draws increasing comparisons, as the season progresses, to some of the finest wingers world football has produced, his partnership with Vardy up front becoming one of the most feared attacking combinations anywhere in the division. Danny Drinkwater, an English midfielder who had progressed through Manchester United's academy without quite establishing himself at that level before moving to Leicester, forms, alongside Kanté, one of the most effective and least heralded central midfield partnerships in the league, his passing range and tactical discipline providing exactly the platform that the more expressive talents of Vardy and Mahrez need in order to flourish further forward. In goal, a Danish goalkeeper named Kasper Schmeichel, son of one of the greatest goalkeepers in the history of the English game, provides a calm, experienced last line of defence, while Wes Morgan, the same combative Jamaican-born centre-back who had marshalled the defence during the previous season's Great Escape, continues as captain, marshalling a backline that proves, across the whole of the coming season, to be considerably more difficult to break down than anyone outside the club had anticipated. It is worth pausing here to notice something that becomes, in retrospect, one of the defining features of this entire remarkable story. Almost none of these central figures, Vardy, Kanté, Mahrez, Drinkwater, arrived at Leicester City via the conventional, well-trodden pathway of expensive transfers from other major clubs or graduation through elite academy systems that produces so many Premier League careers. They arrived from non-league football, from French second division obscurity, from academies at bigger clubs that had judged them not quite good enough. Leicester City's title-winning squad was built, in a very real and specific sense, from players that the rest of professional football had either overlooked entirely or actively rejected. Ranieri's specific tactical approach, once the season begins, proves considerably more disciplined and considerably more coherent than his Tinkerman reputation had led the sceptical English press to expect. Rather than the constant, bewildering team changes that had earned him that nickname years earlier at Chelsea, Ranieri settles quickly on a settled, consistent starting 11 and a clear, focused tactical plan built around defensive solidity, disciplined shape, and lightning-fast counter-attacking football designed specifically to exploit Vardy's extraordinary pace in behind opposition defensive lines. The season begins, in August of 2015, without any particular fanfare or expectation from outside the club itself. Bookmakers price Leicester City, at the very start of the season, as 5,000 to 1 outsiders to win the league title, odds so long that they are treated by almost everyone in football, including many of Leicester's own supporters, as essentially a formality, a number attached to the team simply because bookmakers are required to offer odds on every participating club, not because anyone genuinely believes there is meaningful value in considering the possibility seriously. Leicester's opening results, though, immediately begin to suggest that something rather more interesting than a straightforward mid-table finish might be unfolding. The team wins several of its opening matches, playing with a confidence and a cohesion that looks considerably more assured than a squad assembled from cast-offs and bargain signings has any conventional right to display. Vardy scores freely. Mahrez begins to produce performances of genuine individual brilliance. Kanté's covering work in midfield begins to draw admiring comment from television pundits who, only months earlier, had been openly mocking the club's managerial appointment. By the autumn of 2015, Jamie Vardy embarks on a run of goal-scoring form that becomes, in its own right, one of the most talked-about individual achievements of the entire season. He scores in 11 consecutive Premier League matches, a run that breaks the existing record for consecutive scoring in the competition's history, a record that had stood, until that point, for well over 2 decades. Newspapers that had spent years largely ignoring Leicester City's mid-table existence now run front and back page features on a player who had been working in a factory and playing non-league football only a few years earlier, breaking one of English football's most enduring individual records in the process. The specific and growing disbelief that characterises football media coverage of Leicester City through the autumn and winter of that season deserves to be properly understood because it captures something essential about exactly why this story would eventually become so significant within the wider history of the sport. Premier League title races, in the years both before and after this particular season, have been dominated overwhelmingly by a small handful of clubs with vastly superior financial resources. Clubs capable of assembling squads worth many hundreds of millions of pounds more than Leicester's entire playing squad. The idea that a club with Leicester's modest resources and largely unheralded playing staff could genuinely compete for the title, rather than simply enjoying an unusually good run of results before inevitably fading, strikes almost everyone watching from outside the club as fundamentally implausible. And yet, as autumn turns into winter, and Leicester City remain not merely competitive, but genuinely at or near the very top of the entire Premier League table, that fundamental implausibility begins, slowly and almost reluctantly, to give way to something considerably more remarkable. The possibility, however faint and however carefully hedged by cautious pundits, still expecting the inevitable collapse, that Leicester City might actually be building towards something history had never previously produced. Through the winter months of that extraordinary season, a very specific and very familiar pattern establishes itself, one that becomes, as the weeks pass, an increasingly central part of the wider narrative surrounding Leicester City's improbable campaign. Football pundits, appearing on television week after week, continue to predict, with a confidence that gradually starts to look less like informed analysis and more like simple disbelief, that Leicester's extraordinary form cannot possibly continue. Every difficult run of fixtures is treated, in the media coverage of the time, as the moment the fairy tale will finally end. Every match against one of the traditionally dominant clubs, the ones with the vastly greater resources and the vastly more decorated recent histories, is previewed as the inevitable reality check that will return Leicester City to their expected position somewhere in the comfortable middle of the table. And time and again, across match after match through the winter of 2015 and into the early months of 2016, Leicester simply continue to win, or at the very least continue to avoid the kind of comprehensive defeat that would confirm the widely predicted return to normal service. This particular pattern, prediction followed by contradiction, becomes in its own right one of the recurring narrative threads running through the entire season's media coverage, football writers and television pundits gradually adjusting their language week by week from confident predictions of an imminent collapse toward a considerably more cautious, considerably more respectful acknowledgement that whatever Leicester City were building, it showed no obvious signs of being a temporary aberration destined to correct itself before the season's conclusion. There is a specific psychological dimension to what is happening here that deserves to be properly understood because it says as much about English football's broader assumptions as it does about Leicester City specifically. The Premier League, since its formation in the early 1990s, had been won in every single previous season by one of a very small handful of clubs, those with the greatest historical prestige and, critically, the greatest financial resources to assemble squads of international superstars. The entire structure of expectation within English football punditry had been built around this consistent pattern, a pattern so deeply embedded that many respected football analysts found it genuinely difficult, even as the evidence accumulated in front of them week after week, to properly process what Leicester's continued form actually represented. Meanwhile, several of the traditionally dominant clubs, the ones widely expected to eventually reassert their natural superiority, begin experiencing their own difficulties across this same period. Difficulties that, whether through inconsistent form, managerial upheaval, or simple misfortune, mean that none of them are able to build the kind of sustained winning run that would be required to overhaul Leicester's growing points advantage at the top of the table. Manchester City, Chelsea, Manchester United, and Liverpool, the clubs with the greatest recent history of title success and the greatest financial resources in the entire competition, all experience periods of genuine inconsistency across the campaign, unable, individually or collectively, to apply the kind of sustained pressure that might have derailed Leicester's remarkable charge toward the summit of English football. Arsenal, traditionally one of the most consistent challengers for the Premier League title across the previous 2 decades, emerge as Leicester's most persistent challenger through the winter months. And for a period during the campaign, it is Arsenal rather than any of the traditionally dominant clubs from Manchester or Liverpool who appear best placed to potentially catch and overhaul the league leaders. Tottenham Hotspur, a genuinely talented young squad built around several homegrown players, also emerge as unexpectedly serious contenders, providing, alongside Leicester's own remarkable campaign, one of the more unusual title races the Premier League had produced in years, with 2 clubs that had rarely if ever won the title before both occupying genuine contending positions deep into the season. This particular quality of the season, 3 clubs with comparatively modest recent title-winning histories all occupying genuine contending positions simultaneously, while the traditionally dominant clubs from Manchester and Liverpool struggled to keep pace, adds its own layer of historical significance to the whole campaign. A rare season in which the conventional hierarchy of English football's biggest and wealthiest clubs found itself genuinely and sustainedly challenged from multiple directions at once, rather than facing a single unexpected challenger that most observers could still reasonably expect to fade before the season's conclusion. As the calendar turns from 2015 into 2016, and Leicester City not only maintain their position at the top of the table, but in several crucial weeks actually extend their advantage over their nearest rivals, something genuinely unprecedented begins to take shape within the wider consciousness of English football, and increasingly of football fans around the entire world. International media outlets, initially treating the Leicester story as a quirky, mildly interesting subplot within the broader Premier League season, begin sending journalists to the East Midlands to cover what is rapidly becoming one of the most compelling sporting narratives anywhere on the planet. Claudio Ranieri, the manager whose appointment had been so widely mocked only months earlier, becomes, across this same period, an increasingly beloved figure within English football. His calm, understated demeanour and his evident personal warmth toward his players, standing in notable contrast to the more combative, high-pressure public personas of several of his managerial rivals at wealthier clubs. Stories begin to circulate about small, humanising gestures he makes throughout the season, promising his players a pizza party for every clean sheet they keep, treating the extraordinary pressure of an unprecedented title challenge with a lightness and a genuine warmth that seems to keep his young, largely unheralded squad relaxed and playing with evident freedom and joy, rather than the tension that might reasonably be expected of a group of players suddenly finding themselves at the centre of the biggest story in world football. Journalists who had mocked his appointment only months earlier find themselves by the middle of the season writing considerably warmer profiles of a manager they had once dismissed, several openly admitting their earlier scepticism had been badly misjudged. Ranieri himself responds to this shifting coverage with the same measured, good-humoured grace that had characterised his response to the earlier criticism, neither gloating over his vindication nor pretending that the earlier mockery had not stung, simply continuing to focus, week after week, on the specific job of preparing his team for whatever fixture came next. The players themselves, across countless interviews conducted throughout this remarkable winter and spring, consistently describe a dressing room atmosphere built on genuine togetherness and a shared, almost disbelieving sense of adventure. A group of players who had, in many cases, spent years being told by other clubs that they were not quite good enough, now finding themselves, together, at the top of the most competitive football league on the planet. Jamie Vardy speaks, in numerous interviews across this period, about the specific and profound strangeness of his own personal journey, a player who had been playing non-league football and working in a factory only a few years earlier, now finding himself the top goal scorer in a genuine Premier League title race, a level of career transformation that he himself, by his own frequent admission, still finds difficult to fully comprehend, even as it is happening around him. There is something worth pausing on here, in the specific quality of disbelief that seems to follow this entire Leicester City story everywhere it travels through that long winter and into the spring of 2016. It is not simply that a smaller, less resourced club is competing for the title, remarkable as that alone would have been. It is the specific and sustained nature of that competition, week after week, month after month, without the kind of inevitable collapse that decades of Premier League history had taught pundits, players and supporters alike to expect from any club daring to challenge the established order for this long. By March of 2016, with the season's remaining fixtures narrowing toward their conclusion, Leicester City hold a genuine and increasingly significant advantage at the top of the Premier League table, and the conversation among football pundits, still cautious but now considerably less dismissive than it had been only months earlier, begins to shift from whether Leicester's challenge will inevitably collapse towards something altogether more startling: the genuine, serious possibility that Leicester City, 5,000 to 1 outsiders at the very start of the season, might actually be about to become champions of England. As the season moves into its final weeks, Leicester City's advantage at the top of the Premier League table grows steadily more secure, their nearest challengers unable to close the gap despite their own continued good form. And then, on a Monday evening at the beginning of May in 2016, something happens that produces one of the most unusual and most fondly remembered title-clinching moments in the entire history of English football. Leicester City do not, on the night their Premier League title is finally confirmed, even play a match themselves. Their own fixture that particular week is scheduled for a different date, and so the entire outcome of English football's biggest prize, the achievement that the whole of the football world has spent months watching unfold with mounting disbelief, comes down instead to a match played many miles away at Stamford Bridge in London between Tottenham Hotspur, Leicester's closest remaining challengers, and Chelsea, a club with no direct stake in the outcome beyond its own professional pride. For Leicester City to be confirmed as champions that particular evening, Tottenham simply need to fail to win their match against Chelsea. A draw or a defeat for Tottenham would mathematically hand the title to Leicester City without a ball needing to be kicked by Leicester's own players at all, an almost surreal way for a club to win the biggest prize in English domestic football, watching the decisive moment unfold on television alongside everyone else rather than out on a pitch of their own. Leicester City's players and staff gather that evening at the home of Jamie Vardy, watching the Tottenham vs Chelsea match together on television, an image that becomes, in the days and weeks that follow, one of the most widely shared and most affectionately remembered pieces of footage from the entire remarkable season. Ordinary football millionaires gathered around a television in a private house, waiting to discover whether they have just become champions of England, the same way that millions of ordinary football supporters across the country are also gathered around their own televisions at exactly the same moment. Tottenham take an early lead against Chelsea, and for a period during the match, it appears that Leicester's title celebrations might need to wait at least a little longer, the destiny of the league still technically undecided. But Chelsea fight back across the course of the match, eventually drawing level at 2 goals apiece, a result that, the moment it becomes mathematically confirmed, means Tottenham can no longer catch Leicester City regardless of what happens in any of the season's remaining fixtures. Leicester City, 5,000 to 1 outsiders at the very start of the season, are champions of England. The scenes that follow, both in the room where Leicester's own players are gathered and across the city of Leicester itself, become some of the most joyful and most widely replayed images in the recent history of English football. Players embrace each other with a wild, disbelieving elation, the specific quality of joy belonging to people who have just achieved something that no reasonable calculation at any point over the preceding 12 months would have suggested was genuinely possible. Jamie Vardy, the factory worker turned non-league footballer turned Premier League champion, is filmed in a state of pure, uncomplicated euphoria, embracing teammates and staff in a room that only a year earlier had contained a group of players who had spent Christmas rock bottom of the entire division. Across the city of Leicester itself, supporters flood into the streets in scenes of spontaneous, city-wide celebration rarely seen in English football outside the very biggest and most historically successful clubs. Fans who had followed Leicester City through decades of unremarkable mid-table finishes, through relegations and promotions, and long stretches of complete national irrelevance, find themselves on an ordinary Monday evening in May celebrating a Premier League title that almost none of them had genuinely believed they would live to see. Claudio Ranieri, the manager mocked so widely and so dismissively only a season earlier for accepting what many had considered close to a joke of an appointment, is transformed, virtually overnight, into one of the most celebrated figures in the entire history of English club management. His calm, warm, occasionally emotional public demeanour throughout the extraordinary campaign making him an almost universally beloved figure, not simply among Leicester's own supporters, but across the wider footballing public, including many supporters of rival clubs who had found themselves, almost despite their own natural loyalties, quietly hoping that Leicester's fairy tale would somehow continue all the way to its conclusion. The scale of the underlying achievement, viewed with even a small amount of critical distance, is genuinely difficult to overstate. Leicester City's total wage bill across that title-winning season was a fraction of the amount spent by several of the clubs they had beaten to the title, clubs with vastly greater historical prestige, vastly greater commercial revenue, and vastly greater individual star quality among their playing squads. Football analysts and statisticians, in the years since, have repeatedly described Leicester's title win as one of the most statistically improbable achievements in the history of major professional team sports anywhere in the world, a genuine outlier event that defies almost every conventional model of how success in modern professional football is supposed to be achieved. Bookmakers who had priced Leicester City at 5,000 to 1 at the start of the season find themselves, in the aftermath of the title win, paying out what are reported to be some of the largest sums in the history of sports betting. A small number of supporters and neutral observers who had placed modest bets on Leicester at the very start of the season, more for fun or sentiment than any genuine expectation of winning, suddenly finding themselves considerably richer than they could possibly have imagined only 12 months earlier. There are individual stories from this period that become, in their own small way, part of the wider folklore surrounding the season. Ordinary supporters who had placed modest wagers of only a few pounds, purely out of loyalty or sentiment, at the very start of the season, never remotely expecting a return, suddenly finding themselves holding betting slips worth tens of thousands of pounds. One widely reported story describes a group of Leicester supporters who had pooled a modest sum between them, specifically as an act of faith at the beginning of the season, splitting a payout that transformed several of their lives in ways none of them could have reasonably anticipated when they first placed the bet. These stories, circulated widely in the British press throughout the weeks following the title win, had their own layer of very human, very relatable wonder to a season that already felt, in its broader footballing details, almost too remarkable to be genuinely true. What happens to the central figures of this remarkable story in the years immediately following their unprecedented triumph carries its own complicated and in places genuinely painful weight, a reminder that even the most joyful sporting fairy tales rarely conclude with every subsequent chapter matching the sheer, uncomplicated brightness of their central, defining triumph. Riyad Mahrez, whose dazzling performances throughout the title-winning campaign earn him the Football Writers' Player of the Year award, becomes an increasingly coveted target for wealthier clubs across Europe, eventually moving to Manchester City 2 years after the title win for a fee many times greater than Leicester had originally paid for him, continuing a career that takes him on to further considerable success at one of the clubs whose vast financial resources Leicester's own remarkable squad had so improbably overcome. At Manchester City, Mahrez goes on to win multiple further league titles and eventually a Champions League winner's medal, a trophy that had remained entirely beyond Leicester's own reach even at the peak of their remarkable season, a reminder of exactly how much financial firepower still separated Leicester from the very summit of European football even after their historic domestic triumph. N'Golo Kanté's departure comes considerably sooner, and in circumstances that many Leicester supporters find, in the immediate aftermath, difficult to fully process. Only weeks after inspiring Leicester City to the most improbable title win in the competition's history, Kanté completes a transfer to Chelsea, one of the very clubs Leicester had beaten to the title only months earlier, for a fee that, while substantial, still represents remarkable value for a player of his quality. Kanté goes on, in the immediate following season, to win the Premier League title again, this time with Chelsea, becoming the first player in the competition's history to win back-to-back titles with two different clubs, a statistic that speaks to the specific, almost unrepeatable quality of a player who had arrived in English football as a near-total unknown only 2 years earlier. Jamie Vardy remains at Leicester City for the remainder of his career, becoming, in the years that followed the title win, one of the most reliable and most respected goalscorers in the entire Premier League, eventually breaking the club's all-time goal-scoring record, a statistic that carries its own particular symbolic weight, given how completely his path into professional football had diverged from almost every other player to have worn Leicester's shirt across the club's long history. He continues to represent England at international level throughout this period. His remarkable personal journey from non-league obscurity to Premier League champion and full international frequently cited in the years since was one of modern football's most genuinely inspiring stories of persistence rewarded. Claudio Ranieri's own story, in the immediate aftermath of the title win, takes a considerably more painful turn than almost anyone connected with the club could have anticipated in the joyful weeks following that Monday evening in May. Leicester City, attempting to build on their unprecedented triumph the following season, struggled to replicate anything resembling their title-winning form, and by the following February, with the club dangerously close to the relegation zone they had escaped from so dramatically only 2 seasons earlier, Ranieri is dismissed from his position, a decision that generates immediate and widespread criticism from football pundits, former players, and supporters across the entire footballing world, many of whom consider it an act of remarkable ingratitude toward a manager who had, only 9 months earlier, delivered the single greatest achievement in the club's entire history. The specific timing and manner of Ranieri's dismissal becomes, in its own right, one of the more controversial and more widely debated managerial decisions in recent Premier League history, a stark and uncomfortable reminder of the specific brutality that professional football can display, even toward figures who have delivered achievements of genuine historical significance. Ranieri himself, in the years following his dismissal, speaks about the experience with the same measured, dignified equanimity that had characterised his entire time at the club, expressing gratitude for the experience of leading Leicester to the title while acknowledging the particular pain of the manner in which his time at the club ultimately concluded. Leicester City, despite Ranieri's dismissal, managed to avoid relegation with difficult follow-up season under a new manager, and the club continues, in the years since their extraordinary title win, to establish itself as a considerably more consistent and more respected Premier League presence than the largely unremarkable, perennially struggling club it had been for most of the preceding century. The title win, whatever difficulties and disappointments followed in its immediate aftermath, permanently transforms Leicester City's status within English football. A club that had once been remembered chiefly for a chicken mascot scandal, now permanently and rightfully remembered instead as the author of one of the greatest underdog stories in the entire history of professional sport. The club goes on, in the years following the title win, to enjoy further moments of genuine success, including a run to the quarter-finals of the Champions League only a year after their domestic triumph, a European campaign that itself produces its own memorable moments, before later experiencing the more painful and considerably more familiar experience of eventual relegation from the Premier League, a reminder that even a club transformed as fundamentally as Leicester City had been by their title win still exists within the same difficult, unforgiving competitive ecosystem as every other club in English football, still capable of falling from the heights it had once so improbably reached. There is something worth pausing on in this specific pattern of joy followed by difficulty, glory followed by a considerably more complicated aftermath, because it reflects something genuinely true about how remarkable sporting achievements actually tend to unfold in the real world, as opposed to the neater, more simply satisfying versions that popular memory sometimes prefers to retain. The story of Leicester City's title win is not diminished by what came afterward, by Kanté's swift departure, by Ranieri's painful dismissal, by the club's subsequent return to a more familiar position in the middle reaches of the Premier League table. If anything, the complicated, imperfect nature of everything that followed makes the achievement itself, viewed now with the clarity of hindsight, feel even more remarkable, a single, perfect season of genuine sporting magic that neither the players, nor the manager, nor the club as an institution ever quite managed to fully repeat or properly build upon, precisely because what they had achieved was, in the truest sense of the word, a genuine miracle rather than the beginning of a new and sustainable dynasty. In the years since Leicester City's extraordinary title win, Football analysts, economists, and historians of the sport have returned again and again to a single, persistent question. Could anything resembling this achievement ever genuinely happen again, anywhere in modern professional football? The overwhelming consensus among those who have studied the specific financial and structural conditions of modern football in the years since 2016 is that the answer is almost certainly no, and the reasons behind that consensus are worth understanding properly because they illuminate exactly why Leicester's achievement was not simply remarkable in the moment, but has become, with the passage of time, increasingly and almost uniquely unrepeatable. The financial gulf between the very biggest clubs in European football and clubs of Leicester's size and resources has widened dramatically in the years since 2016, driven by ever larger television broadcasting deals, ever more sophisticated global commercial operations, and increasingly the direct financial backing of the wealthiest clubs by sovereign wealth funds and billionaire ownership groups, with resources that dwarf anything available to a club like Leicester City, even at the peak of their own considerable achievements. The specific financial ecosystem that allowed a squad assembled largely from bargain signings and rejected academy prospects to compete with and ultimately defeat clubs backed by vastly greater resources has, in the years since, become considerably less permeable, the gap between football's financial elite and everyone else growing wider with almost every passing season. Several of English football's most prominent clubs have, in the years since 2016, been acquired by extremely wealthy individual owners or state-backed investment consortiums, transforming the competitive landscape of the Premier League in ways that make the specific financial conditions of Leicester's own title-winning season look, in retrospect, almost like a brief and unrepeatable historical window, rather than a permanent feature of the competition. Where 2015 and 16 still contained a meaningful number of clubs, operating with broadly comparable, if still unequal, financial resources, the years since have seen an increasingly small handful of clubs pull away financially, to a degree that makes the kind of gap Leicester overcame that season look considerably more modest than the gaps that exist within the competition today. There is also a specific structural dimension to why Leicester's achievement looks, in retrospect, so difficult to ever repeat. The very biggest clubs in modern football have, in the years since 2016, invested increasingly heavily and increasingly sophisticated resources into exactly the kind of data analysis, scouting networks, and squad depth that might once have allowed a smaller club to occasionally identify undervalued talents before their wealthier rivals noticed them. The specific market inefficiency that allowed Leicester to sign N'Golo Kanté from French second division football, or Riyad Mahrez from similarly modest circumstances, for fees that look, in hindsight, almost absurdly low relative to their eventual quality, has narrowed considerably as football's wealthiest clubs have professionalised their own scouting and recruitment operations to a degree that makes this specific kind of undiscovered bargain considerably harder to find. Beyond the purely financial and structural explanations, there is also something worth acknowledging about the specific, almost alchemical quality of what Leicester City actually achieved that season, a combination of individual player form, tactical cohesion, managerial management, and sheer footballing fortune that even the most sophisticated modern analytics departments would struggle to reliably reproduce on demand. Jamie Vardy's specific goal-scoring form that season, N'Golo Kanté's specific defensive influence, Riyad Mahrez's specific creative brilliance, all arriving simultaneously at the same club under the same calm and skillful management in the same single season, represents a genuine confluence of individual excellence that even Leicester City itself, despite considerable subsequent investment and effort, has never come close to fully replicating in the years since. This is, in many ways, precisely why the story continues to resonate so powerfully with football supporters, not merely in England, but right around the entire world, years after the specific details of that Premier League season have receded from immediate memory. It represents something that modern professional sport, increasingly dominated by vast financial inequality between a handful of super clubs and everyone else, seems structurally designed to prevent from ever happening again. A group of players considered not good enough by bigger clubs, assembled for a fraction of the cost of their eventual rivals, guided by a manager whose appointment had been treated as a national joke, defeating the greatest financial powers in the sport, not through some fluke of a single cup match, but across the entire grinding length of a 38-match league season, the single fairest and most demanding test that football possesses for determining genuine, sustained excellence. Sports commentators and academics studying the economics of football have, in the years since, used Leicester City's title win as a kind of benchmark case study, a genuine natural experiment demonstrating what remains possible, at least in principle, even within a sport increasingly dominated by financial inequality, while simultaneously acknowledging that the specific conditions that allowed it to happen, the exact combination of undervalued talent, tactical intelligence, and sheer fortune, may never align again in quite the same way, at quite the same time, at quite the same football club. There is a broader cultural significance to the story too, one that extends well beyond the specific mechanics of football finance and squad building. Leicester City's triumph became, almost immediately, a genuine global symbol of the underdog defeating impossible odds, referenced in contexts far beyond football itself, cited by business leaders, politicians, and motivational speakers around the world as a genuine, real-world example of the impossible becoming possible through persistence, unity, and self-belief. The specific phrase 5,000 to 1, the odds bookmakers had originally attached to Leicester's title chances, becomes in the years since a kind of permanent cultural shorthand for any situation in which conventional wisdom is completely and spectacularly overturned. It is worth remembering, too, exactly what this achievement meant to the city of Leicester itself, a place that had spent generations existing somewhat in the shadow of England's larger and more prominent football cities, its football club treated, for the majority of its long history, as a permanently unglamorous also-ran. The title win transformed not simply the club's football fortunes, but something of the city's own sense of itself, an entire community suddenly and permanently associated in the wider national and international consciousness with one of the greatest sporting achievements British sport has ever produced, rather than with decades of unremarkable mid-table anonymity. The players and staff who delivered this achievement, whatever happened to their individual careers in the years that followed, remain permanently linked, in the history of English football, to a single season that changed, in a very real sense, what English football's own supporters and pundits believed was genuinely possible. Every subsequent season, when a smaller club enjoys an unexpectedly good run of form, or when a newly promoted side punches above its financial weight, pundits and supporters alike still invoke Leicester City's name, a permanent reference point for exactly what football, at its most beautifully unpredictable, remains capable of producing, however rarely, however improbably, however completely against every reasonable expectation the sport's financial structure would otherwise suggest. It is worth pausing, away from the drama of results and trophies, to look more closely at the specific technical and human qualities that made this particular Leicester City team function so effectively, because the achievement, remarkable as its scale undoubtedly was not simply a product of luck or a strange, unrepeatable alignment of circumstance. It was built on a genuinely coherent and genuinely well-executed footballing philosophy, one that Ranieri and his coaching staff had identified and refined with real precision across the course of that single extraordinary season. The tactical foundation of Leicester's title-winning football rested on a specific and disciplined defensive shape, a compact, well-organised unit that conceded remarkably few clear scoring opportunities across the whole of the season, built around the experienced organisational qualities of Wes Morgan at the back, and the extraordinary defensive coverage that N'Golo Kanté provided in front of him. Opposition teams, across the course of the season, repeatedly found themselves unable to create the kind of clean, unpressured attacking opportunities that most Premier League matches against a smaller club would ordinarily be expected to generate. Kanté's specific ability to read danger and intercept opposition attacks before they could properly develop functioning, almost as an additional defensive line operating from within the midfield itself. This defensive solidity provided the platform for exactly the kind of football that suited Leicester's attacking talents most effectively. Rapid, direct counter-attacking moves that exploited the specific and extraordinary pace of Jamie Vardy running into space behind opposition defensive lines. Time and again across that season, Leicester would withstand periods of opposition pressure, absorb attacking pressure, while remaining defensively disciplined, and then break forward with a speed and directness that consistently caught even the most well-organised opposition defences underprepared. Vardy's specific pace over the first several yards of any sprint proving to be a weapon that very few defenders in the entire league were able to consistently contain. Riyad Mahrez, operating with genuine creative freedom within this same tactical structure, provided the specific individual quality that turned promising counter-attacking positions into genuine, clinical goal-scoring opportunities. His close control and his ability to beat defenders in tight spaces, allowing Leicester to consistently create clear chances, even against opposition sides that had, in theory, organised their own defensive structure specifically to try to prevent exactly this kind of threat. Claudio Ranieri's specific contribution to this tactical framework deserves particular recognition because it represents a considerable departure from the reputation that had followed him into the job only months earlier. Rather than the constant tinkering that had earned him his nickname at Chelsea years before, Ranieri settled quickly on a clear and consistent tactical approach and, crucially, resisted the temptation to significantly alter it even during the periods of the season when pressure and scrutiny were at their most intense. This tactical discipline, maintaining faith in a settled system and a settled group of players, even as the stakes grew steadily higher across the season, represents, in the assessment of numerous football analysts studying the campaign in the years since, one of the most underappreciated aspects of Ranieri's managerial achievement that season. Beyond the pure tactics, though, there is the specific and widely discussed question of how Ranieri managed the psychological and emotional dimension of an unprecedented title challenge, keeping a young, largely unheralded group of players relaxed and playing with evident freedom and joy, even as the pressure and the media attention surrounding their remarkable campaign grew to a level that none of them had ever previously experienced in their professional careers. The pizza parties that Ranieri promised his players for every clean sheet kept throughout the season become, in the retelling of this story in the years since, one of its most charming and most frequently cited details, a small, almost whimsical gesture that nonetheless speaks to something genuinely significant about Ranieri's specific approach to managing an unprecedented and potentially overwhelming set of circumstances. Rather than treating his players to increasingly serious and increasingly pressured team talks as the title race intensified, Ranieri appears to have understood, with a wisdom that many considerably more celebrated managers might have struggled to replicate, that keeping his squad relaxed, connected, and genuinely enjoying their remarkable collective experience was likely to produce better footballing results than piling additional pressure onto players already operating in genuinely unprecedented territory. Several of the players, in interviews conducted throughout that season and in the years since, describe Ranieri specifically as a kind of father figure within the dressing room, a description that recurs with striking consistency across numerous separate accounts from different members of the squad. He is remembered by his own players, not primarily as a tactical innovator, though his tactical management of the campaign was genuinely excellent, but as a man who created an environment in which a group of previously overlooked and undervalued footballers could believe, collectively, that something extraordinary was genuinely possible, without that belief ever curdling into the kind of suffocating pressure that has derailed other unexpected title challenges in other seasons at other clubs. There is a lesson here, cited frequently by sports psychologists and management theorists studying the Leicester City story in the years since, about the specific and often underappreciated importance of psychological safety within high-performing teams. The idea that people, whether in football or in any other high-pressure collaborative endeavour, tend to perform at their absolute best, not when subjected to maximum pressure and fear, but when they feel genuinely supported, genuinely trusted, and genuinely free to express their own individual talents without fear of harsh punishment for occasional mistakes. Ranieri's Leicester City, whatever the specific tactical details of their remarkable season, provides one of the most widely cited real-world examples of exactly this principle in action. A group of talented individuals, given the specific conditions, both tactical and psychological, to produce collectively something considerably greater than the sum of what any reasonable assessment of their individual talents, taken in isolation, would have predicted. There is a broader story here too, one that extends beyond the specific football played across that remarkable season, concerning what this achievement actually meant to the ordinary people of Leicester, a city that had spent generations quietly existing in the considerable shadow of England's larger, more prominent footballing centres. Leicester, a city of a few 100,000 people in the East Midlands, had never previously been particularly associated, in the wider national consciousness, with sporting glory of any kind. Its football club had spent the majority of its long history as a solid but unremarkable presence in English football, respected by nobody outside its own supporters, remembered nationally, if at all, for unfortunate incidents rather than genuine sporting achievement. The city itself, known historically for its shoe and textile manufacturing industries, had experienced its own share of the economic difficulties that affected many similar industrial cities across the English Midlands and North through the closing decades of the 20th century, a place that, like its football club, had rarely found itself at the centre of national attention for particularly positive reasons. The title win changes something fundamental in how the city understands and presents itself, almost overnight. When the trophy is finally paraded through the streets of Leicester, in an open-top bus procession that draws crowds estimated in the hundreds of thousands, filling the city's streets from the earliest hours of the morning, the scenes captured on television cameras and shared around the world convey something considerably larger than simple football celebration. They capture an entire community's collective, disbelieving joy at having been, for one remarkable season, the centre of the entire footballing world's attention, for reasons that had nothing to do with unfortunate scandals or unwanted headlines, and everything to do with a genuine, historic sporting achievement that no reasonable person could have predicted only a year earlier. Picture the specific scene of that parade day, families arriving before dawn to secure a decent vantage point along the procession route, grandparents lifting grandchildren onto their shoulders for a better view, entire streets draped in the club's blue colours in a manner that the city itself had genuinely never witnessed before at this particular scale. The open-top bus moves slowly through streets lined many people deep on both sides, players holding the trophy aloft to a response that sounds, in the archive footage that survives from that day, less like ordinary football celebration and more like the specific, overwhelming noise of an entire community releasing decades of accumulated, quietly held disappointment all at once, transformed instantly into something approaching pure, uncomplicated joy. Local businesses across the city report their best trading day in years. Schools allow children to attend with permission specifically to witness the parade. Elderly supporters, some of whom had followed the club through the whole of the 20th century without ever once witnessing anything resembling major trophy success, are interviewed by television crews with tears visible on their faces, several of them speaking of parents who had died without ever having the chance to see their beloved football club achieve anything close to this. It is, in the specific and genuine testimony of countless ordinary Leicester residents captured that day, less a football celebration than something closer to a citywide exhalation, an entire community finally permitted to believe that their patient, largely unrewarded loyalty across generations had, in the end, actually been worth it. Long-time Leicester City supporters, interviewed extensively by journalists in the weeks and months following the title win, consistently describe an experience that goes beyond ordinary sporting celebration, many speaking of parents and grandparents who had followed the club faithfully through decades of unremarkable mid-table finishes and painful relegations, who had never lived to see anything resembling genuine major trophy success, and the particular bittersweet emotion of finally witnessing this achievement, sometimes decades later than these earlier generations of supporters might reasonably have hoped for. Several supporters speak specifically of visiting the graves of parents or grandparents in the days following the title win, a quiet, private gesture of sharing the news with people who had passed away without ever getting the chance to see their beloved club achieve something this significant, a detail that captures, perhaps more powerfully than any statistic or any scene of public celebration, exactly how deeply this achievement resonated within the specific, generational fabric of the city's own footballing community. The story also resonates, in the years since, considerably beyond the specific footballing world of Leicester City's own supporters, becoming one of those rare sporting achievements that genuinely transcends the sport in which it occurred, discussed and referenced by people with only passing interest in football at all. It takes its place in the broader cultural memory of remarkable sporting underdog stories, alongside other similarly improbable achievements from the history of world sport, moments where a team or an individual with vastly inferior resources or reputation somehow overcame opponents that every reasonable calculation suggested should have won comfortably. Sports historians and commentators, seeking comparisons for the sheer scale of Leicester's achievement, frequently reach for other similarly legendary underdog stories from the history of world sport, moments like a group of amateur American ice hockey players defeating the vastly more experienced and heavily favoured Soviet team at the 1980 Winter Olympics, a result so unexpected at the time that it became known simply as the miracle on ice, a phrase that itself echoes the language so often used to describe Leicester's own achievement. What both stories share, beyond their specific sporting details, is this same fundamental quality, an outcome so completely outside the range of reasonable expectation that it forces an entire audience, in the moment of witnessing it, to genuinely reconsider what they believe to be possible within their sport, Other commentators reach further back into sporting history for comparison, citing moments like a modest provincial boxer defeating a heavily favoured world champion, or a small unfancied nation's cricket or rugby team overcoming a traditional powerhouse in a single decisive match. But even among this wider company of celebrated sporting upsets, Leicester's achievement retains a particular distinction that these historians and commentators return to again and again. Almost every other legendary underdog story in the history of world sport describes a single match, a single fight, a single decisive contest in which an inferior side or competitor produced one extraordinary performance against the run of expected form. Leicester City's achievement was not the product of one remarkable afternoon. It was sustained, replicated and defended across an entire 38-match league season, the single fairest, longest and most statistically demanding test that professional football possesses for separating genuine, sustained excellence from a single fortunate afternoon. This is precisely why so many serious students of sport continue to regard it, even years later, as perhaps the single most remarkable achievement in the entire history of team sport. There is something worth noting too about how this specific quality of the Leicester story, its almost universal appeal across cultural and even sporting boundaries, has helped it endure so vividly in popular memory in the years since it actually happened. Supporters of rival Premier League clubs, people who would ordinarily have no particular reason to celebrate a competitor's success, frequently describe finding themselves, almost against their own natural instincts, quietly cheering for Leicester City throughout that remarkable season, drawn in by the same universal appeal of the underdog defying impossible odds that has powered great sporting stories across every culture and every era of organised competition. International audiences with only limited previous exposure to English football found themselves drawn into the story too. Television audiences in countries with no particular historical connection to Leicester City, or even to English football more broadly, tuning into matches throughout that remarkable spring, curious to witness whether this genuinely improbable story would actually reach its fairy tale conclusion. The story becomes, for a period, one of the most discussed sporting narratives anywhere on the planet, a testament to the specific, universal power of a genuine underdog story to capture attention and imagination far beyond the particular sport or the particular country in which it originated. Let us slow down for a while and sit inside a single afternoon from that remarkable season, because it is in the smallest, most specific details of one particular match that the true scale of what Leicester City were achieving becomes easiest to properly feel. It is February of 2016, and Leicester City travel to the Etihad Stadium to face Manchester City, one of the wealthiest clubs in the entire world, backed by the resources of a Middle Eastern ownership group and assembled at a cost that dwarfs, many times over, the entire value of Leicester's own modest squad. Manchester City, at this point in the season, remain genuine title contenders themselves, and this particular fixture is widely previewed in the days beforehand as exactly the kind of match that will finally expose Leicester's title challenge as the temporary anomaly that so many pundits have continued to insist it must eventually prove to be. The theory, repeated across television previews and newspaper columns in the days leading up to the match, is a familiar one by this point in the season. Leicester have done wonderfully well against the Premier League's more modest and more mid-table opposition, the argument runs, but surely, against a Manchester City squad containing some of the most expensively assembled attacking talent anywhere in world football, on Manchester City's own ground, in front of their own supporters, the gulf in quality and resources between the two clubs will finally unmistakably assert itself. What actually happens, across 90 minutes played out in front of a stunned home crowd, becomes one of the defining and most frequently replayed matches of Leicester's entire title-winning campaign. Leicester, rather than sitting back defensively and hoping merely to survive against opposition with vastly greater individual quality, play with a confidence and a directness that seems to catch Manchester City's own players and coaching staff completely off guard. Jamie Vardy scores twice, his specific explosive pace repeatedly exposing gaps in a Manchester City defensive line that has simply never had to contend with a striker of this particular type, this particular speed, running in behind them with such relentless repeated directness. Robert Huth, an unglamorous, unheralded central defender signed by Leicester on a free transfer, someone that almost no football supporter outside Leicester's own fan base could have named at the start of the season, scores as well, heading home from a set piece, with the same unglamorous effectiveness that had characterised so much of Leicester's defensive solidity throughout the campaign. Leicester win the match 3-1, a result so emphatic and so completely contrary to the pre-match narrative of an inevitable reality check that it becomes almost instantly one of the single most talked about results of the entire Premier League season. Television pundits, watching from the studio, struggle visibly to find adequate language for what they have just witnessed, several of them openly admitting in the immediate aftermath of the match that they no longer feel confident dismissing Leicester's title challenge as a temporary anomaly destined to collapse under sufficient pressure. Think for a moment about what this specific result actually represented, beyond the simple 3 points it delivered. Manchester City's entire starting 11 that afternoon had been assembled at a combined cost, in transfer fees alone, that ran into many hundreds of millions of pounds, containing full international players from some of the most celebrated footballing nations on the planet. Leicester's own starting 11, by contrast, had been assembled for a fraction of that sum, containing several players who had been playing non-league or lower division football only a handful of years earlier, or who had been rejected by other clubs' academies as teenagers. The contrast, laid out plainly like this, sounds almost too stark to be believable. The kind of gap in resources and pedigree that should, by every reasonable footballing logic, produce a comfortable home victory, rather than the kind of one-sided defeat that Manchester City's own supporters were forced to witness from their own stands that particular afternoon. And yet, for 90 minutes on that February afternoon in Manchester, it was Leicester City who looked like the superior football team, more organised, more direct, more clinical in front of goal, more completely in control of the match's fundamental rhythm and shape. It was not luck, in any meaningful sense of that word. It was not simply Manchester City having an unusually poor afternoon. It was a genuinely superior tactical performance, delivered by a genuinely well-drilled and well-organised team, against opposition with vastly greater individual quality, but, on this particular afternoon, considerably less cohesion and considerably less collective conviction in what they were trying to achieve together. This single match, more than almost any other single result across the whole of that extraordinary season, marks the specific moment when the wider footballing world's scepticism about Leicester's title challenge began to give way, in earnest, to genuine, if still cautious, belief. If Leicester could travel to one of the wealthiest and most expensively assembled squads in the entire world and defeat them so comprehensively and so convincingly on their own ground, then perhaps the growing consensus among football pundits began to suggest there really was something considerably more substantial happening here than a temporary and soon-to-be-corrected quirk of the early season table. Manchester City's own manager, in his press conference following the match, offers a rueful, respectful assessment of what his side has just experienced, acknowledging that Leicester had fully deserved their victory and had played, on the day, like genuine title contenders rather than temporary occupants of a position they would soon be forced to relinquish. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the more significant moments of validation that Leicester's remarkable campaign receives across the entire season, an acknowledgement from one of the clubs with the greatest possible reason to want to see their own challenge exposed as temporary, that what Leicester City were building genuinely deserved to be taken seriously. Matches like this one, scattered across the whole of that unforgettable season, each one adding its own specific piece of evidence to the gradually accumulating case that Leicester City's challenge was not going to simply fade away, are worth remembering individually in their own specific detail rather than simply as statistics folded into the season's final table, because it was not one single moment of magic that won Leicester City the title. It was performance after performance, week after week, month after month, an entire season's worth of ordinary Saturday and Sunday afternoons, in which a group of undervalued, overlooked footballers simply continued, match after match, to play better than anyone outside their own dressing room believed they possibly could. Let us go back, for a while, to where so much of this story actually began, because it is only by returning there that its whole shape becomes properly visible. Picture a factory floor in Sheffield, years before any of what you have just heard had happened. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, the specific tired ache of a long shift spent manufacturing medical splints settling into a young man's shoulders and legs. He clocks off, changes out of his work clothes, and cycles across the city to a non-league football ground, where a crowd numbering in the low hundreds is gathering for a match that will not be televised, will not be reported beyond a small local newspaper, will not be remembered by anyone beyond the players and the small loyal group of supporters who follow this particular unglamorous level of English football out of pure love for the game, rather than any expectation of ever seeing anything resembling genuine glory. This is Jamie Vardy, several years before a Premier League title, several years before the record for consecutive scoring, several years before millions of people around the world would know his name. He does not know, in this moment, cycling tired and aching to a non-league match after a full shift on a factory floor, that a Premier League title is even a realistic possibility for a player at his current level. He knows only the specific, immediate reality of his life at this exact point. Work and football, football and work. A cycle that most people watching from outside would assume was simply what his entire life was destined to consist of. There is a version of this story, and it is worth holding on to as we approach its end, in which none of what came later, the transfer to Leicester, the great escape, the extraordinary title-winning season, actually changes what was happening in this earlier, simpler moment. The factory floor and the non-league pitch and the tired cycle home were real. The specific, unglamorous persistence of a young man who kept playing, kept working, kept believing that something better might eventually be possible, was real too, entirely his own, built without any guarantee that it would ever lead anywhere beyond exactly the modest life he was already living. Everything that came afterward, the title, the record, the global fame, grew outward from this same root, this same unglamorous persistence of a young man who refused to fully give up on a dream that every conventional measure of his early career had suggested was no longer realistic. The specific quality that carried Jamie Vardy from a factory floor in Sheffield to a Premier League title, the refusal to accept that an early setback represented the final word on what his career could become, was the very same quality, in its own way, that Claudio Ranieri's entire Leicester City squad demonstrated collectively across that extraordinary season, a refusal to accept that the club's modest resources and modest recent history represented an unbreakable ceiling on what they could achieve together. And perhaps this is the most important thing to understand about this whole remarkable story, more important in the end than any of the specific statistics or specific matches that made up its individual chapters. The achievement that captured the imagination of football supporters around the entire world was built, at its foundation, from individual stories of exactly this kind. Players who had been told, in various ways and at various points in their careers, that they were not quite good enough, and who simply refused to fully accept that verdict, continuing to work, continuing to play, continuing to believe that circumstances might eventually change, even when every reasonable indicator suggested they probably would not. There is something worth remembering too about the countless Leicester City supporters who had followed this unglamorous, unremarkable football club through decades of relegations and promotions and unremarkable mid-table finishes, who had turned up, season after season, to watch a team that gave them, for the overwhelming majority of the club's long history, remarkably little to celebrate. Their persistence, their willingness to keep believing in a club that had rarely rewarded that belief with anything resembling genuine success, mirrors, in its own quieter and less individually dramatic way, exactly the same quality that carried Jamie Vardy from a factory floor to football's biggest stage. Somewhere in Leicester tonight, in ordinary homes across an ordinary English city, there are still people who remember exactly where they were on that Monday evening, in May, when Tottenham drew with Chelsea, and an entire football club's impossible dream suddenly, finally, became reality. They remember it not simply as a football result, but as a moment that changed, permanently, what an entire city believed was possible for the club they had loved, without much reward, for their whole lives. Let that be part of what you carry with you as this story draws toward its close. Not simply the trophy, or the record-breaking goals, or the 5,000 to 1 odds that made this achievement so historically remarkable, but the specific, unglamorous persistence that built it, factory floors and non-league pitches, rejected academy prospects and overlooked French second division midfielders, an Italian manager mocked by an entire nation's football media, and a city that kept believing in its unglamorous football club through decades when belief was rarely rewarded with anything beyond mid-table disappointment. If you were to lay out the specific facts of Leicester City's title-winning season on a page, the way football statisticians periodically do, you would find a record that reads, even now, almost like a work of fiction rather than an accurate account of a genuine Premier League campaign. 5,000 to 1. That is the figure bookmakers attached to Leicester City's chances of winning the title at the very start of the season, odds so long that they were treated, by almost everyone in football, as essentially a formality rather than a genuine reflection of meaningful possibility. By the time the season concluded, that figure had become one of the most frequently cited statistics in the entire history of sports betting, a number that continues to be invoked in the years since, whenever anyone wishes to describe an outcome that defies all reasonable expectation. Jamie Vardy's run of scoring in 11 consecutive Premier League matches broke a record that had stood for over 20 years, a statistic that speaks to the specific, individual brilliance he brought to that campaign, delivered by a player who had been playing non-league football and working in a factory only a handful of years earlier. Riyad Mahrez's performances throughout the season earn him the Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year award, a considerable individual honour for a player who had arrived in English football from French second division obscurity only a couple of seasons earlier. N'Golo Kanté's defensive contribution throughout the campaign, measured by distance covered and tackles and interceptions made, remains, in the years since, one of the most statistically remarkable individual defensive seasons the Premier League's data analysts have ever recorded. Leicester City's total wage bill across that title-winning season, when compared against the wage bills of the clubs they defeated to the title, tells its own remarkable story. Clubs with financial resources, many multiples greater than Leicester's own modest budget, clubs capable of assembling squads of full international superstars purchased for transfer fees that individually exceeded Leicester's entire outlay across several transfer windows combined, were simply unable to match the collective quality and cohesion that Ranieri's squad produced across the whole of that 38-match season. Football analytics experts, studying the campaign in the years since using increasingly sophisticated statistical models designed to predict league outcomes based on squad quality and financial resources, have repeatedly found that models built on conventional indicators of success would have assigned Leicester City a probability of winning the title so low as to be statistically almost negligible, a finding that has led several respected sports statisticians to describe the season as one of the single most significant statistical outliers in the recorded history of major professional team sports anywhere in the world, not simply English football specifically. Some analysts have gone further still, attempting to model exactly how many times a Premier League season would theoretically need to be replayed under broadly similar starting conditions before a club with Leicester's specific combination of modest resources and modest squad quality could realistically be expected to win the title through chance alone. The resulting figures, produced by several independent studies in the years since, consistently arrive at numbers so large that they reinforce, from a purely statistical perspective, exactly the sense of wonder that ordinary football supporters felt watching the season unfold in real time without any need for advanced modelling at all. This was not a season that could be reasonably expected to repeat itself if you played it out again and again under similar conditions. It was a genuine, singular outlier, the kind of result that statistical models are generally designed to treat as an error in the data, rather than an authentic outcome, except that, in this one specific and remarkable case, it was entirely real. Claudio Ranieri himself receives numerous personal honours in the aftermath of the title win, recognised by football writers and by wider British and international media as one of the most significant managerial achievements in the sport's modern history, a remarkable personal vindication for a manager who had, only months earlier, been dismissed by much of the English football media as a joke appointment, following his own recent professional embarrassment with the Greek national team. It is a record that, taken purely on its own statistical terms, already represents one of the most remarkable single seasons any football club has ever produced. But it is the specific context surrounding those statistics, the 5,000 to 1 odds, the modest wage bill, the collection of players rejected or overlooked by bigger clubs, the manager mocked by his own country's football media, that elevates this achievement from merely an excellent statistical outlier into something closer to genuine sporting folklore, a story that continues to be told and retold years after the specific details of that Premier League season have faded from the immediate memory of casual football followers. There is a version of history in which Leicester City's 2015-16 season unfolds as an unusually good but ultimately unremarkable campaign, a newly established Premier League club enjoying a pleasant run of form before finishing comfortably in the top half of the table, a result that would have satisfied nobody's expectations of genuine transformation, but would have represented, on its own modest terms, a reasonably successful season. That version of the season did not happen. What happened instead was something that statisticians, historians, and ordinary football supporters around the entire world continue to describe using exactly the same word over and over in the years since it actually occurred. A miracle. There is something worth sitting with in these final quiet moments before this story draws to its proper close, about what a number like 5,000 to 1 actually represents, and about what it might mean for anyone listening tonight who happens to be facing their own version of impossible odds. A bookmaker does not arrive at a figure like 5,000 to 1 carelessly. It is the product of careful calculation, historical precedent, and genuine expertise, an informed professional judgment about what is realistically achievable given all the available evidence. By every reasonable measure available to the people who calculated those odds in the summer of 2015, Leicester City winning the Premier League title was not simply unlikely, it was, for all practical purposes, essentially impossible, a mathematical near certainty that would not happen, calculated by people whose entire professional expertise lay in accurately assessing exactly this kind of probability. And yet it happened anyway, not through some inexplicable fluke or a single moment of good fortune that could never be repeated or explained, but through an entire season's worth of disciplined, patient, unglamorous work performed by a group of people who had, individually and collectively, been underestimated by almost everyone with a professional obligation to accurately assess their potential. Jamie Vardy had been told, at 16, that he was not good enough for professional football. N'Golo Kanté had spent his entire early career in French football considered too slight, too unassuming, to make the significant impact he would eventually make. Claudio Ranieri had been dismissed only months earlier as a manager whose best days were clearly behind him, unable to guide even a modest national team to acceptable results. Every single one of these specific individual judgments was made by people with genuine expertise in their respective fields, football scouts and national team selection committees, and football pundits with decades of accumulated professional experience, and every single one of those expert judgments turned out to be wrong, not through malice or incompetence, but simply because the specific and unpredictable alchemy of individual human potential, properly nurtured and properly supported, frequently exceeds what even the most experienced and well-informed observers believe is realistically possible. This is, perhaps, the deepest and most genuinely useful lesson that Leicester City's extraordinary season offers to anyone listening tonight who might be facing their own particular version of impossible odds, whatever specific shape those odds happen to take in their own life. It is not a naive or simplistic message suggesting that belief alone guarantees success, because belief alone did not win Leicester City the Premier League title. It took discipline and patience and an entire season of unglamorous, difficult work performed match after match, week after week, often with very little external validation or encouragement along the way. But it is a genuine and evidence-based reminder that the odds calculated by experts, however sophisticated their methods and however extensive their experience, are not a fixed and unchangeable verdict on what is ultimately possible. They are simply a reflection of what has usually happened before, in broadly similar circumstances and history, in football as in life more broadly, occasionally produces genuine exceptions to even its most reliable and most consistently observed patterns. Think about the specific chain of individual decisions that had to align for this particular miracle to occur. A scout who saw something in a factory worker playing non-league football that Sheffield Wednesday's own academy had missed years earlier. A club willing to take a modest financial risk on a French second division midfielder that almost no other Premier League club had bothered to properly scout. A chairman willing to appoint a manager that the entire football media had openly mocked, and willing to stand by that appointment even as the criticism continued. None of these individual decisions, taken alone, guaranteed anything resembling the eventual outcome, but taken together, compounding across an entire season of patient, disciplined effort, they produced something that no reasonable calculation at any earlier point could have predicted. There is real comfort and real genuine encouragement in understanding this properly. The specific odds against you, whatever they happen to be in your own particular circumstances, were calculated based on what has usually happened before. They were not calculated with specific knowledge of your own particular capacity for patience, for discipline, for the kind of quiet, unglamorous persistence that a factory worker from Sheffield brought to a non-league football pitch for years before anyone beyond his own small circle had any reason to believe it would ever lead anywhere significant. This does not mean every long shot succeeds. Most, in football as in life, do not, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Leicester City's achievement remains remarkable precisely because it is so rare, precisely because the overwhelming majority of 5,000 to 1 outsiders in football and in every other competitive field where such odds might reasonably be calculated do not defy those odds. But rare is not the same as impossible, and the specific, quiet persistence that this story celebrates, the refusal to fully accept an expert judgment about your own limitations, the willingness to keep working even when the reasonable odds suggest that working will probably not be enough, remains worth honouring, regardless of how any particular individual story ultimately concludes. There is a further part of this story worth telling before we come to its close, because the version of events that centres entirely on Vardy, Mahrez, Kanté and Ranieri, remarkable as their individual contributions undoubtedly were, risks overlooking several other figures whose quieter, less individually celebrated contributions were every bit as essential to the eventual triumph. Wes Morgan, the Jamaican-born centre-back who captains the side throughout the title-winning campaign, embodies, perhaps more completely than any other individual player, the specific unglamorous solidity upon which Leicester's entire remarkable season was built. Morgan had joined Leicester some years earlier from Nottingham Forest, a solid but unspectacular defender without the kind of eye-catching individual quality that draws admiring newspaper columns or lucrative boot sponsorship deals. What he provided instead, week after week throughout that campaign, was a calm, experienced organisational presence at the heart of Leicester's defence, marshalling a backline that conceded remarkably few goals across the whole of the season, doing the specific, unglamorous defensive work that rarely appears in highlight reels, but that provides the essential foundation upon which every attacking triumph is actually built. Robert Huth, the German-born central defender who partners Morgan throughout the campaign, provides a similarly understated but essential contribution, a player who had struggled to establish himself at previous clubs including Chelsea and Stoke City, finding at Leicester, in the twilight years of his career, the platform to deliver some of the most important defensive performances of his entire professional life. His goals against significant opposition throughout the campaign, scored from the kind of unglamorous set-piece situations that rarely generate individual acclaim, proved decisive in several of the season's most important matches. Danny Drinkwater's partnership with Neojai Kanté in central midfield receives, in most retellings of this story, considerably less attention than Kanté's own individually spectacular defensive performances, and yet Drinkwater's passing range and his own considerable defensive discipline provide exactly the platform that allows Kanté's more expansive covering role to function as effectively as it does. Drinkwater, an England Academy graduate who had struggled to establish himself during a loan spell away from Manchester United's own first team, finds at Leicester the regular first-team football that eventually earns him a full England international call-up, a personal vindication for a player who had spent several years on the fringes of the professional game without ever quite breaking through. Kasper Schmeichel, the Danish goalkeeper, whose father Peter Schmeichel had been widely regarded as one of the finest goalkeepers in the entire history of the Premier League during his own playing career at Manchester United, carries throughout his own career the particular pressure of an inevitable and constant comparison to his father's considerable legacy. His performances throughout Leicester's title-winning campaign, consistently excellent without ever demanding the same spectacular individual acclaim that Vardy or Mahrez receive, provide exactly the calm, reliable last line of defence that a title-winning side requires, a specific quality of quiet consistency that rarely generates headlines, but that proves, across an entire 38-match season, every bit as valuable as any single moment of individual match-winning brilliance. It is worth remembering, when we tell this story, that no single player, however brilliant, wins a Premier League title alone. Leicester City's achievement was built from 11 players working in genuine, disciplined harmony, supported by a bench of substitutes and squad players who accepted limited playing time with the same collective spirit that characterised the entire campaign, all of it held together by a manager who understood, with real wisdom, that his job was not simply to celebrate his most gifted individuals, but to create the specific conditions in which every single member of his squad, celebrated or otherwise, could contribute fully to something considerably larger than any one of them could have achieved alone. This is, perhaps, one of the quieter but most genuinely important lessons that Leicester City's extraordinary season offers, the story that gets told and retold in highlight reels and newspaper retrospectives, inevitably centres on the most spectacular individual contributions: Vardy's goals, Mahrez's dribbles, Kanté's extraordinary defensive coverage, but the full and complete truth of how this miracle was actually built includes in equal measure the quieter, less celebrated contributions of players like Morgan, Huth, Drinkwater and Schmeichel, whose specific, disciplined professionalism, week after week, provided exactly the foundation upon which their more individually celebrated teammates were able to produce the moments of brilliance that the wider world remembers most vividly. So here, at the end of the night, is where we leave them. Not in the boardroom where a manager's dismissal was decided only months after his greatest triumph. Not in the transfer negotiations that took a title-winning midfielder to one of the very clubs his team had just defeated. Not even in the parade through the streets of Leicester, joyful and enormous as those scenes genuinely were. Let us leave them instead somewhere quieter. A living room in Leicester, on an ordinary Monday evening in May of 2016. A family gathered around a television, watching a football match taking place many miles away in London. A match their own team is not even playing in, waiting to discover whether a dream that had seemed entirely impossible only 12 months earlier is finally about to come true. Think about the whole shape of it. A football club founded in 1884 that spent more than a century as a permanently unremarkable presence in English football, admired by nobody outside its own city, remembered nationally, when remembered at all, for the wrong reasons entirely. A team that sat bottom of the entire Premier League table only 18 months before becoming champions, saved from relegation by a manager who would not be there to see the ultimate triumph his own escape had made possible. A squad assembled from factory workers and non-league journeymen and rejected academy prospects, and overlooked French second division players, guided by a manager that an entire nation's football media had mocked as a joke appointment only months before he delivered one of the greatest managerial achievements the sport has ever produced. And then, within a single season, a Premier League title, delivered not through some inexplicable fluke, but through months of disciplined, patient, collective work, a genuine sporting miracle witnessed by millions of people around the entire world, including many who had never previously had any reason to care about English football's second most successful club from the East Midlands. Both versions of this story are true. The century of unremarkable mid-table anonymity and the single perfect season of genuine sporting magic. Neither one exists without the other. You cannot have the miracle without first having the century of ordinary disappointment that made it feel so completely, so gloriously impossible, so far beyond anything the club's own long, unremarkable history had ever given its supporters real reason to expect. There is no version of this story where Leicester City simply wins the title without first enduring the Great Escape, without first surviving a season at the very bottom of the table, without first assembling a squad from players that bigger, wealthier clubs had decided were not quite good enough. The whole shape of the miracle depends on exactly how unlikely it was, on exactly how many separate judgments by exactly how many football experts turned out, in the end, to be wrong. Football has given us other extraordinary stories, told across other nights in this same series. Stories of individual genius, tragic and triumphant in their own different ways. This story offers something different, and in its own way something just as worth carrying with you tonight. A demonstration that an entire group of overlooked, underestimated people, brought together under the right guidance and given the right conditions to believe in themselves collectively, can occasionally produce something that defies every reasonable calculation an outside expert might make about their realistic potential. It is a quieter kind of magic than any single moment of individual brilliance, built collectively rather than by one person alone, but a magic all the same, the simple, hard-won magic of a whole group of people who were told, by almost everyone qualified to judge, that they did not have what it takes, and who proved, together, patiently, over the course of one unforgettable season, that the judgment had simply been wrong. Somewhere tonight, in an ordinary city in the English Midlands that most of the football world had never previously thought twice about, there are still people who remember exactly where they were on that Monday evening in May, still people who kept a betting slip from the very start of that season as a keepsake, rather than any genuine expectation of winning, still people who tell their children and grandchildren about the season an entire city stopped believing anything was truly impossible. Let that be the picture you carry with you as you drift off tonight. Not the trophy alone, and not the parade through the streets, joyful as it was, but the whole shape of the story, the century of quiet disappointment, and the single perfect season, the factory floor in Sheffield, and the Premier League title, the manager mocked by an entire nation, and the same manager celebrated only months later as one of the finest the English game has ever produced. That whole shape held together, joy and disappointment and persistence and reward, is what makes this story worth telling and worth remembering. For as long as people continue to watch football and wonder, before every new season begins, exactly what might turn out to be possible this time, however long the odds currently look, however settled the conventional wisdom currently feels. Somewhere, in the quiet of an ordinary evening, long before any of this happened, a factory worker cycles home from a non-league match, tired, aching, entirely unaware that a Premier League title is still years away, and yet somehow, impossibly, already on its way toward him. And somewhere else, in a different quiet evening, an Italian manager considers a job offer from a modest English club that almost nobody expects him to succeed at, unaware that he is about to produce the finest season of his entire long career. Neither of them knows, in these quiet, ordinary moments, exactly what is coming, and for a little while longer, before the whole world discovers what they are about to build together, none of it has happened yet. There is only the factory floor, and the modest job offer, and the particular, private, uncomplicated belief of people who have not yet been told, by history itself, that what they are about to attempt is supposed to be impossible, and who would very likely have tried anyway, even if someone had told them. Rest now. Let all of this settle. Let your body grow heavy and your mind grow quiet. The stadium lights have dimmed, the crowds have gone home, but the stories never stop, and they never really finish either. Not the good ones, not the ones worth telling twice. Sleep well, Leicester. Rest easy, knowing that somewhere, even now, the impossible is quietly getting ready to happen again, in some other unremarkable city, to some other unheralded team, whenever the world least expects it.